De Graaf is a Dutch architect and writer. He is partner in the Office of Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, and co-founder of its think tank, AMO. He's author of Four Walls and a Roof, The Complex Nature of a Simple Profession.
The book is called Architecture Against Architecture. It's a manifesto. It's, as manifestos are, based on a radical premise, because essentially a radical premise warrants a manifesto. I wanted to write a manifesto. I desperately wanted to write a manifesto. Generally, I must say I'm not a writer. I'm an architect who writes books. And that means that whenever I write a book, I sort of infiltrate an existing format. So I wrote a novel, which isn't really a novel. I wrote a lexicon or a dictionary, which isn't really a dictionary. And this time the format was the manifesto. Simply because, I kind of think it is time for a manifesto. I enjoy the stylistic nature of manifesto. So the fact that I wanted to write a manifesto probably made my assessment of the current world of architecture maybe a little more gloomy than it would have been had I not wanted to write a manifesto. So forgive the rhetorical exaggeration. Architecture in its current form has lost all credibility. I think we can all agree on that. And the second, if architects wish to be relevant, and the second premise actually automatically follows from the first, architecture must be wholly reinvented. Now, I would be remiss or vaguely hypocritical if I could just start from that. I think architecture has a wonderful tendency, me and my colleagues, to tell the world what they ought to be doing very, very assertively, without ever actually doing any proper introspection. I think architects are about the least self-reflective brand of people you could possibly get. So therefore, the first part is called Architects, where I have a serious plea that architects get their own house in order. And then the second part is called Architecture, and that is actually about the subject with which I think architects ought to realign themselves. If they are subjects with which they are already engaging, perhaps engage differently, engage more radically, engage more wholeheartedly, or perhaps engage with subjects that they hadn't thought of engaging with. So the book has two parts, Architects and Architecture. Each part has 7 chapters. The first part about architects is I think we should end any and all focus on figureheads. I've worked for a long time with a very, very famous figurehead, and I can tell you that is not a lasting proposition for architecture as a whole. I will not go into any great detail, but just take it from me. Welcome labor unions, even that in my current capacity as somebody who owns a practice, and I guess to whom you could refer as an employer, that might also seem a bit of a strange thing. But I wasn't always an employer. I come from from a family with a somewhat different background. You know, any and all industries have labor unions. They're a normal fact of life as far as I'm concerned. As soon as you mention it in architecture, it's, oh gosh, you get that kind of reaction. I think, we ought to get over that first, regardless of the fact we'll retire at 67. I have 5 years and 1 month to go before I will start lying about my age. Abolish authorship. I think authorship is, particularly in the form that it's taking shape at the moment, with patents and buildings being copyrighted, a very bad thing. Architecture is an art of imitation, I would say, and imitation and evolution go hand in hand. Rely on AI for matters of taste. I think AI is actually potentially a great liberation. I mean, anybody who's involved in an architecture project knows the moment the fun begins, and the fun is no fun. I mean, you have a series of relatively rational decisions when you make a building, column spans, positions of cores, daylights, etc. It all makes fair, but then the color of the kitchen top begins, the size of the wallpaper, and I've always dreaded that because they're essentially arbitrary decisions which have to be reasoned more than the rational decisions. If we could delegate them to AI, I mean, AI could talk to clients about those things, and we would be able to get on with the important things, hopefully. And the distinction between theory and practice, I'm assuming everybody is in favor of that, just academia isn't, but it's very, very necessary. The book contains a proposal that, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao had the Chinese intelligentsia re-educated by working on the land. I propose that current academia is re-educated on building sites, at least for a year, for students to graduate, but more importantly, for teachers to qualify as teachers. It's also a necessity. Anyway, free architecture from the concept of art. The art economy is not a good economy for architecture, because if you don't have everything in art, you have nothing, you have no certainty. Nothing, I think, that is that. Cut out the middleman, speaks for itself. Stop building until the existing stock runs out, also speaks for itself, I think. So some of these things are common sense. But in my world, in our world, a lot of common sense qualifies as radical, so it's not that hard to write a manifesto. After all, pardon all things built, that's a consequence. If you stop building, you need to use what you have. Plan for obsolescence, buildings last shorter and shorter and shorter. So plan in a way for dismantling, so you save a lot of waste. Adapt to climate change, stop claiming to mitigate it. In the book, this chapter has the title, Forget Sustainability. I think sustainability is a nauseating cliche. It's a petty excuse. It gives us the false sense of security that we can keep climate change at bay. I mean, anybody who watches climate conferences, opening statements, they're generally an admission of why the goals of the previous conference weren't met, and you know in advance that the goals of this one won't be met. So climate change will persist, and maybe the source of a new architectural avant-garde should be to develop prototypes to coexist with the inevitable rather than the false sense of insecurity that we might avert the inevitable. Now, work not to have clients to work. I think that's actually a direct quote from the Fountainhead, if I'm not mistaken. That goes from the, I was very nervous writing that because I mean, I make the case that there are no good and bad countries. That there are no good and bad patrons, therefore, and the current world where I think that is a fair case to make. It makes an analogy between Mohammed bin Salman and Elon Musk as a tech entrepreneur with an active interest in governance, and then a hereditary governing royal with an interest in tech, and that at least when it comes to the physical results in terms of urbanism, they look suspiciously the same. I mean, it leaves you as an architect. I mean, if you want to be a good person, you have two choices. Either you stop working everywhere, the glass is half full or half empty, or you work everywhere with the disposition that you cultivate an extreme independence. And by working in as many places as possible, you have alternatives and you might cultivate independence, which is a kind of veiled case, I guess, for our own office in its current form. Our own office complies to about half of these things, and to half of these it doesn't at all. But there I relish the distinction between myself as a writer and myself as, with the other responsibilities I happen to have acquired over the years.
I was rather taken with Owen Hatherley, who wrote on the back of the book here, which I thought was well put. He describes you as a mole, giving away power's secrets, burrowing into the world of 21st century oligarchy to reveal to the rest of us those weak spots we should strike in order to collapse the entire edifice. And I guess to a lot of people, as you work for a leading global practice and are talking about the issues which probably are quite difficult to balance against what the practice actually produces. So are you a mole, or are you a flag bearer for the revolution?
He also, in a way, we had a discussion live, and he also compared me to Jamie Oliver, who wrote a critique on celebrity chefs. which I guess is true. But then again, if I were ever to read a book on celebrity chefs, it would probably be one by Jamie Oliver and not by anybody else. So in that sense, I'm not sure if I'm a mole. I can't be. The initial title of this book, before it became a manifesto, was Elephants in the Room. I had the distinct urge to write a book about all the subjects architects prefer not to talk about. And I guess if I am something, you know, if you're in a room full of elephants and they threaten, and it's dark, and they threaten to trample you, your reflex is to switch on the light. And I guess that is, in a way, what I have wanted to do with this book. You know, there is a lot of noise and there's a lot of talk in the world of architecture, but there is very little that is actually being talked about. I mean, people speak a lot and they say very little. I think that is something I, at least, have to stand in the profession. So the book is mainly to discuss to start a long overdue discussion.
And is it a discussion which is based on the experience of working in a, let's say, architecture practice of working for oligarchs, political leaders, all sorts?
It's based on my own experience, on my own view of the world, because that is the only experience I have. It's very singular, but it's a very long experience.
So if you were working in social housing, say, and providing decent homes for people to live in, would you suggest that architecture has collapsed in the way that you have just described?
I think architecture has a credibility problem, and of course architects still build. Architects still do their job, like many professionals do their job, but I think they have a credibility issue because in a way the situation is at odds with the pretenses. I think there is a lot of virtue posturing in architecture, and at the same time there's a lot not said, and an enormous amount of virtue posturing with an incredible lack of looking at oneself. It's very interesting. I watched the premiere of a movie on foreign architects working in Albania last Monday. It was presented by the documentary maker, and there were all these architects singing how wonderful it was because there were no rules there. You could do what you wanted as an architect, and the local architects could learn from you, but you could also learn from them, and blah 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 blah. And it was just that, and the rules had been abolished. Municipals had rules so they could do, and that all had happened in a free Albania, which was no longer governed by a dictator, you know, the communist dictator back in place. There's somebody in the audience asked, but I mean, skipping the rules, giving unilateral approval rights to a prime minister, isn't that the workings of a dictatorship? Isn't that the work of a dictator? The documentary maker hadn't really thought of that. She was totally sort of taken aback. It sort of, then there were some kind of Albanian activists in the audience, so it all went sharply downhill from there. And I pity the documentary maker, really, 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 because I really wish that, you know, half the architects which had appeared in the film would have been there.
Yep.
And would have seen this, because I think despite the genuine will to do good things, there is a baffling unawareness that good things in a certain context can actually be bad things. I think architecture is a very myopic profession, generally not overly aware of the context in which they work to integrate results, etc., etc. And that's what all my books do, in a way, a kind of recalibration with context and pointing out the banal differences and the mutual misunderstandings between architecture and the world, and this is one of them in that sense.
So would you say Eddie Rama is mistaken then in using architects and architecture to establish some credibility for his
No, Eddie Rama's not mistaken. Eddie Rama is the quintessential postmodern politician. That is a phenomenon. Trump is a postmodern politician, you know, somebody who can profess evangelists' right, Christian values, who hasn't lived by Christian values, but he knows it will give him an electoral advantage. Edi Rama is the type of politician that appears with an EU flag next to the national flags and a cultural diplomatic offensive in the direction of the AU, and then 2 weeks later he's on the board of peace behind Trump. He's a very tall man, etc. there. So he is somebody for whom convictions are functional, etc. So the whole engagement of architecture that has a point well beyond. I mean, one of the roles why he's building so much is, of course, because, like Britain, construction is the closest thing to a national industry. It brings foreign investment in. It also brings a large share of the money that from activities that Albania was famous for before he cleaned up the image can actually be laundered and go into construction. You know, all of these things go on, and the weird thing is, he de facto admits that, and none of the architects talk about it. They talk about, oh, but I mean, I hope the construction industry is up to executing the details of my building to the same standards as in my homeland. The discussion goes as far as that. And that irritates the crap out of me. And that's what then gets me fired up enough to write a red book. And I mean, and by the way, I hope in some way that my firm or our firm doesn't do that in the same way.
But as a postmodern politician, but using starchitecture to represent his view of the world, yet Trump is also a postmodern politician, but he goes for a totally different approach to architecture.
But isn't it interesting
isn't
it interesting that they both have an interest in architecture? The right and the left, that MBS, as a ruling autocrat in the world, has a distinct, in the first thing they do is embark on an architectural campaign. Edi Rama wants as a political, embarks on an architectural campaign. Trump, one of the very first decrees he issued was that federal architecture had to be in the neoclassical style again, etc., etc. There is a shared interest in architecture from the left, from the right, from autocrats, from democratically elected, in relation to power, that should get architects worried. The fact that Edi Rama relies on a very different type of architecture than Trump doesn't altogether alter the phenomenon. And we are mistaken to thinking that architecture of a particular style, I think, represents a particular ideology. I think those days are long gone. I mean, the same type of architecture can play a completely different role in one political system than it can do in the next. I mean, modern architecture, industrial production, prefabrication, 90-degree angles, lack of ornament, that once, gave many people an affordable home in one system. In a capitalist system, it simply is a facilitator of high profits. When buildings are cheap, they can either be rented or bought cheaply. When buildings are cheap, they can either facilitate very high profits when they are sold expensively. And I think there is too much of a fixation on Edi Rama is a good person because he has a good taste. He's a benevolent dictator with taste, as opposed to, a malevolent dictator with no taste, but there is still an eerie symmetry.
Yes. But he's different. Trump is a developer, of course. Edi Rama is an artist.
Yeah, but
and
even,
so
there,
Edi Rama
even those are suspiciously close.
But Edi Rama started painting buildings before he got into starchitecture, didn't he? So he was changing the environment from an artistic point of view, whereas one presumes that Trump's love of classical architecture has to do with historic views of power.
Power is the quintessential business of politics, and it's the same in either case. I mean, I see a typical Eastern European country, the way a lot of them have gone since the fall of the Berlin Wall, where, they enter a democratic system, and with every new election, power gets further consolidated He's been re-elected 4 times. You know, owns a significant slice of the media. The likelihood of anybody else being elected is diminished with every new time he is elected. So, and my contribution to the book that will be there about the Albanian project. There's a book out called The Albanian Files,
Right.
where all architects, in a way, are asked for their projects. They present their projects unofficially in honor of Edi Rama. My contribution to that book was an open letter to Edi Rama, where I asked him to cancel the next elections and please never have an election again, because if he would lose an election, that would be terrible for us architects. It's best if he became prime minister for life, then president for life, and possibly king afterwards, like Zog. So I guess irony is the sort of mild resistance you have left as an architect.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he hasn't read the letter yet.
I think he has, and it's in the book, but I don't know whether he or his assistant read it. You never know. The book is out in a couple of months, so I guess we'll see.
So I mean, you say in the book that art is haunted by a freedom it can never conquer, an architecture one that it can never achieve. I mean, do you think Edi Rama is using architects as a sort of big canvas that, because he does actually have the ability to do architecture in the way that he pleases, doesn't he?
Well, he has a way to have architects do what pleases him.
Yes.
Which is, I'm not sure whether that's indirectly maybe the same.
But you do what he says.
Well, I don't. I never talked to him really. I mean, luckily, I mean, we've been working in that country for 10 years. Well, before there was a change of law in the summer of 2024, where all municipal approvals were suspended, where all the planning departments of cities were sort of sent home or charged with corruption, and where the sole approval of every single building that gets built in the country rests with a state agency, and that state agency supposedly presents him almost every project that gets realized in the country. So there are a whole system of rules and regulations, even building regs, that did exist before, and I've experienced that before, is suspended for a kind of moment like that. And it's on the one hand, it has propelled architecture to a very great speed, a very spectacular architecture which would probably otherwise be grinded down by rules, but it has also created a very volatile environment where one wrong word, and in that sense I'm always happy not to be in the film. I mean, that letter, I don't know if he's read it. Maybe he has and he laughs about it. Maybe he hasn't, and he will read it once the book is out, and then I guess we will be able to tell what happens and how innocent it is.
And if he becomes king, we know where he gets it from.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about your views on climate change, which you liken to the surfer who doesn't control the waves but goes with it? I mean, what is the end result of, if we all take that view, all living in floating houses or houses on stilts? And
the surfer on the wave is actually a line from Rem in Whatever Happened to Urbanism in SML Excel, and it's a metaphor for architecture, that architects essentially are not a political power in themselves, that what architects do is that they ride the forces of society, that's the waves, and that sometimes they can use the speed and the strength of the waves to make a twist and go against the waves, and that you can only go against the grain if you engage and use the forces at play. So that's not necessarily related to climate change. My views on climate change are that it's a very serious thing. Obviously, that's hardly a controversial position, but my view is that it's probably a more serious thing than we realize. I think even sustainability policies are like ostrich policies. I think given the failure, given the amount of wars also at the moment, and given, first of all, wars produce a lot of CO2. Second of all, wars, of course, push that whole issue very, very far to the back. So I think the heating up of the Earth will go very, very fast. And then climate change will be what it professes to be, change. It's not the comfortable transition from one stable state, meteorological state, to another slightly more, less comfortable stable state. It will be disruption as a standard condition. I mean, most narratives still have this kind of Christian structure to it, also climate narratives, that there is a state, then there was a calling, and then there was a problem, and then there is somehow a resolution or a situation after, before, during, after. I don't think there will be any after. I think there was before, then it was there, and there will only be during. And in that sense, it's a narrative that doesn't follow the classical narrative lines, and that's what the chapter tries to indicate. And that architecture is a discipline that fundamentally strives for permanence in a universe governed by process. It strives for fixity in a condition of flux, a timelessness against the logic of time, and that at some point the act of resistance, which is embedded in architecture, will become impossible or fundamentally different. If it's the natural tendency of every system to drift towards entropy, architecture in its striving for order is a very weird exception, because it means it's a temporary suspension of the inevitable at the expense of continuous expenditure of energy. And at what point do the forces become such that that energy will no longer be possible? And I think climate change sort of announces that. Architecture is a very physical act, but it weirdly defies the laws of physics, in my view. So, and in that sense, I find all the narratives, laudable in the sense that it's apparently high on the agenda. That is a good thing, but at the same time, they're evidence of denial as well, as far as I'm concerned.
And talking about other great issues of the day around AI, I was very interested when you talked about the fact that you asked AI to suggest what a OMA building in Jeddah would be like. Yeah. And does that suggest that by working within a firm like OMA, there is, in your eyes, always a signature of architecture that can be replicated by AI? Or, I can think of...
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Chris. Quite a number of firms who might find it difficult to put in their name and expect to get out something that they would recognise.
It's very well. This was. Books are always. It's the interesting thing. Books are finished about a year before they make it to the bookshelf. There's editing, and then certain chapters are finished long before the book as a whole is finished. So the chapter on AI was in the early days of AI. The chapter describes a project that went pear-shaped because the client kept changing his mind with every image that he saw. He traveled the world, had a very lively Instagram account of his travels, and whenever he encountered something new, that became the brief of the project, which is as unstable as climate change. And it's just hopeless. Frustrating, and then they wouldn't pay until we did what the CEO said, but then the CEO was never there, so it was a huge frustration, and a financial desire. Anything. It's a project I don't want to be reminded of until I thought of it again. And then I thought, what would have happened in a situation like this had we had AI at our disposal? Saw the early results where you can press a button and sort of feminine chic, Danish design, Japanese minimalism, all these moods. There were these mood boards all the time. This is what the CEO wants, mood. If it's, press B for building. And so the chapter is an imaginary journey, reliving of the project, how that would have gone had we had AI. In other words, had we had machines to sort of engage the CEO in his travels and his varying tastes, would we have ended up with a building? That's what it speculates. And then we literally do that. So there's a guy in the office, American guy, part of our IT department, the new specialist on AI. young as the discipline was. So one day, one entire afternoon, we sat down and we, in a way, mimicked the course of the project with prompts. And it describes that it's a weird mixture of impressive speeds and erroneous results. And also, the prompts also change the context. For instance, there is Kingdom Tower in the background, which is actually not in Jeddah but in Riyadh, but then it features all of a sudden in Jeddah, and then it changes when our building changes. It was a magical, so Salvador Dali, a magical source of wonderful irrationality. When we did an OMA building and immediately produced a skyscraper. I don't know why, we haven't built that many skyscrapers, but you saw remnants of. Then we said, no, we need a 2-story building. Then it made a 2-story building where each floor was 100 meters high. So still a skyscraper. And only after, the weird thing is that instead of drawing, you need to be extremely proficient in language to get results. So maybe that's an announcement of an architecture of the future, that the architecture of the future is for both.
Yeah, need to communicate properly.
But then in the end, we ended up with something that, when we least expected it, sort of matched what the guy had said he wanted. So it ends on a hopeful note there. That maybe did, yeah.
And you mentioned a number of architects I'm quite keen on, I have to say, and I think you mentioned them in a positive way. I mean, Bernard Rudowski, Architecture Without Architects, Walter Siegel, his DIY homes in Lewisham, John Habraken, flexibility in housing, and John Turner. Now, I mean, I think the interesting thing about those, I think they had really positive contributions, but Rudowski ended up making sandals. Walter Siegel, only the two parts of his development that hasn't been replicated in London, at least. There have been some others around the world, but not. And John Habraken too didn't really catch on in a way that we've got a couple of very good examples. There's a building called Park Road by Grimshaw, which is sort of Habraken principles. But these things which actually haven't really happened, great ideas which need to be done. But John Turner, I would say he's probably one of the most influential architects in the world, because actually the most successful form of housing is the barriadas, the informal houses around Africa, South America, India, with billions of people living in them. And John Turner changed them from being slums into homes that in a lot of particularly South American cities are now being turned into livable environments. But he's the only one of those that...
well, I'm not sure. I think Habraken lives on in Aravena.
Right, yes.
I think the ideas of Walter Siegel are executed on quite a significant scale, for instance, in Almere, in the Netherlands, where during the financial crisis, and nobody wanted to invest in land, no developers, etc., then the market always defaults to these kind of models. So there's an enormous amount of very ambitious self-building programs. You had a very ambitious self-building program in South America. I mean, these people may not be, the iconic architects of the 20th century in the same way that Corbusier, Mies, Kahn, Aalto, or whatever were, but their ideas definitely do live on, and I think there is something nice about that. It's also something nice about mentioning the architects from a recent, nevertheless forgotten past, and their ideas do live on. I'm not entirely sure, even if the names don't, I'm not entirely sure the ideas are dead. And there was something disarmingly charming about the earnestness that I attribute to a generation that I didn't know myself because I wasn't there.
Yes, no, they produce really interesting work, and contrast, because one of the things you talk about in terms of, I guess, your experience, but certainly happens within that architects practice. They talk about the incessant perfectionism, and to a certain extent they were the opposite of that. They enjoyed the informal and the unfinished, really. So,
well, but they didn't resist entropy in the same way. That is true. So they were perhaps, even if they're not very well known, they were less part of that tragedy.
yes. But the incessant perfectionism interests me too. I mean, I've been in a few offices.
You remind me of
architects.
you remind me of all kinds of formulations which I meanwhile forgot I wrote. But
Well, perfectionism is something which the senior architect needs to ensure that everybody is following his views of what the end product should be, is it not? Even though he may well be separated from its actual design, and he sees it, or she sees it almost at the end of the process of design.
well, that doesn't sound like a familiar description of work the way I experience it, but the nature of work in most architects' practices, and this harps back to the beginning, is, and this is very, I have to be careful, but it's essentially the more senior you are, the less you know what you want. Even though I would say it's fair to say that the decision power or the selection for variance rests with seniors. So the more you progress in the ranks, the more editorial your role and the less productive your role is, of course. And perfection has a very different relation to production than it has to editing. I think when you need to produce and you have nothing, you need to keep perfection at bay in the creative process. Because when you're obsessed with, you produce nothing. As an editor, you need to be extremely paranoid and critical. So there is a sort of mirrored inverse relation around perfection. And I remember actually in the office, if I look at the projects we did that I think represent breakthroughs, or that were really moments that from then on we had discovered something in architecture, the first moment the model or the drawing or whatever it was appeared, the standard experience was always that we didn't know. We didn't know if we had stumbled across something incredibly profound or whether we'd just gone mad. And I think these are very, very close, and they're far closer than we think. And I think that is something inside architecture. That's mostly the subject matter actually of my previous book. That is that tolerance, in a way, is I think what drives architecture, and it's more than perfection. I think it's the tolerance for that moment and the breath, saying nothing. In quintessential moments there is silence, I think, and then moving on. So.
Yes.
I don't know whether that answers your question.
Well, I would say I found that interesting because I've worked with quite a lot of practices where this is the case, and if you're dealing with somebody, let's say, lower down the order, it's very difficult to get them to change anything because they're terrified of going back upstairs and suggesting that things are not quite what they'd previously agreed. And so that idea of a fixed idea of what the end result should be, very inflexible, I've found, in the discussions I've had with a number of more junior people in architects' offices, put it that way.
Okay.
But
it's not something I recognise, I must say, but I mean,
right.
But people might just not tell me.
Well, it appeared. I haven't got the page number it appeared on, but so finally we'll open it up for questions from the floor in a moment. But you do a pretty good demolition job on the idea of timber building and I presume CLT in terms of talking about the that we're going to need to plant forests the size of Argentina every year in order to deliver structures that can replace concrete. So
Well, if it were to become the common mode of building for everything that is being built, I think that's what you need. At least that's what we research, and I found that it's shocking truth that, you know, the radical solution of one problem can be the radical creation of the next. Such is the course of history of man, but
yeah. So you don't mind using CLT in small quantities then?
well, I think that, you know, this is always so wonderful. One of the biggest cuts in CO2 emission was actually when China shifted from coal actually to oil and gas. Still fossil fuels, but infinitely less polluting than coal, but still fossil fuels. So if you were to be really dogmatic, really finger pointing, you know, if you love to call people out bad guys, that development, so then the biggest reduction wouldn't even register. And very often it is that. I'm not against CLT, I'm just against the category, from now on we build in wood, aren't we great? I mean, Arabs do wonderful work actually with hybrid structures, where they do cut the amount of steel in concrete immensely by, you know, wood can also take tension like steel and things like that. I mean, it's when dogmaticism and virtue posturing gets in the way of intelligence, I have a real problem with it. Hence the extreme example.
And in terms of your, you write a lot about retrofitting, refurbishment of buildings rather than building new. What is your position where you don't get quite or if there's an argument between the developer and the conservation group who want to save a building, if you don't get a building that works quite as well, you accept those deficiencies because it is doing the right thing in terms of the planet?
No, I don't think there are buildings that work quite as well or buildings that don't work quite as well. The principle, the building is a response to a demand for space, that's one. Building, two, is a way to create value, financial value. Buildings are a product of space, are a financial product. The priorities of developers are financial. So whenever an existing building is demolished, it's rarely that a smaller building takes its place. Never happens.
Yeah.
It's always a bigger building, double, triple the size. And the idea, and then there are all kinds of arguments like it doesn't work. Essentially, building is the most conservative, least innovative, evolutionary industry there is. You know, I think its essential inventions of modern constructions are 150 years old, and since then, marginal changes. So to say that it doesn't, the demands of the time, they're all generally bogus arguments for an excuse to take away a smaller building, build a bigger building, increase land value, increase profit. It's very, the Netherlands, if I may. One political party came into office, say there is a housing shortage, supposedly, and we're going to build 10 entirely new cities. At the same time, a city like Utrecht has so much vacancy that it could accommodate every single home seeker in the Netherlands. So there are massive vacancies in combination with presumed shortages, with ambition construction program. That doesn't add up. If you divide all the square meters of housing in the Netherlands by the population, you have 55 square meter per inhabitant. Now that is, I think, 10 meters more than the existence minimum as defined once by the Baas. You know, and then you're not even talking families, you're talking per individual, you know, babies, etc., etc. So I know we can't expropriate everybody, you can't take away the empty second homes of people, but I mean, it does, it's that simple arithmetic indicates that there is something wrong, and that arithmetic, even if you can't change the reality, indicates to what extent financial motives have taken over building rather than spatial needs. And the two chapters, like stop building until the existing stock runs out, preserve everything built, they actually belong together. They're an attempt to force a catharsis in which that problem becomes so visible and so strong that the conditions will change, and that we stop building until the conditions have fundamentally changed, that it's revealed the extent to which actually we build for money looking for a home rather than people. That's the point of that thing.
Rem Koolhaas said you can't be an architect unless you're a brilliant optimist. And I thought the book was fantastically well written and well researched, but there wasn't a lot of optimism in it for me. And you said architects are the least self-reflective, and in the verified company of, I've only just recently got to know people like Wolf Pree and Patrick Schumacher. If you look at people like Neil McLaughlin or Stanton Williams or Eliza Morrison, they are incredibly self-reflective.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much.
No comment.
Right. but okay. Well,
I am, by the way, an incredible optimist.
Right, okay.
I mean, I wrote this book. I love architecture. I mean, the general misconception is that I hate architecture and it's just this cynical, sour. I'm a very cheerful person. I laugh a lot. I'm an incredible optimist. I love architecture. I love architecture, in fact, so much that I don't want architects to destroy architecture. And if things go on unmediated, I'm afraid, I really worry that is where we might be heading. Let me choose my words carefully. But I'm an optimist. I love architecture. I love people. I'm sure plenty of people do not live up to my negative descriptions of them, but here you go.
Okay. I also wondered why you chose to start the book with David A.J. and other people that have sort of made strange moral decisions in their personal lives.
Well, we don't know if he did.
Well,
that chapter isn't about David Ajay. He just happened to be in the right place at the right time, or in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he was just the perfect example of a phenomenon that I think is not good. Reputation-based. Entirely. I mean, I always thought that the qualities attributed to him were ridiculous. But I also think it's incredibly unfair that once a man, which we idolize to the point of a saint, once there is even as much as a rumor, or once there is as much of an allegation that he, falls from grace to the deepest dungeons. And the bad thing is that he has, an office of 200 people, half of which lose their jobs. These people also had a career. These people also had an income. They had their livelihoods. A business, an industry that is so contingent on reputation proves to be incredibly volatile. And that's it. I could have used Richard Meyer. But, I mean, David Ajay was more current. And David Ajay is in some ways are more extreme. I mean, he was the personification of the good, the personification of racial emancipation. He was a personification of the possibility of an entire continent. I mean, he was lauded by Barack Obama, etc., etc. And then there is, within 24 hours after that, I remember it very, very clearly. This was when I read the book. 24 hours, look down the drain. And I think that is something our industry should take itself to heart, without saying, I don't know what he did or didn't do.
But then the next chapter is about trade unions and in architecture, and I wonder. It started off with
my uncle. Yeah.
And I don't see how that unionising architecture is going to solve some of those problems.
Well, I'm very. It's strange. I mean, in my career, I've been an employee. I've been a junior and then a junior, and then slowly moved up the rank. I've been at my current job since January 2nd, 1996. So it's 30 years this year. And I've had practically all roles and all, you talk about people at the bottom, talk about people at the top. I've had all of those roles. Half of the time I was an owner, half of the time I was on the pay list. And I think trade union, I mean, you can't start a trade. People ask that, would you start a trade? No, of course not. Because as soon as an employer starts a trade union, it's a toothless kind of animal. So it's how you deal with trade unions when they present themselves. And there are examples. And I think this whole mood of aren't we in it for creativity? Aren't we artists? Isn't this is not a job, this is a vocation, this is a mission, this is a calling. Architecture is work, period. And I think, and therefore work comes with workers' rights. And the whole, you know, if I see generally in many places where we go, initially you get decent fees until they discover how much downward pressure they can get away with. If we are prepared to underpay employees, if we are prepared to have them double the shifts that they should be working, then we can give more work for the same money, or we can lower our fees. The moment kind of clients become aware of it, they come to expect it, and in that sense, if you can present simply an Excel sheet with the wages people get, people know where they stand, and it could actually be a tool to defend also a fee structure for architects as a whole. I think a stronger profession might actually start with more rights of those, you know, who do the work. I wouldn't say at the bottom of the profession, but I think that's a misconception. And
Architecture Without Architects, and I think it's really important here. The reason I always loved that book was because Architecture Without Architects is about architecture, where the architect is the man or the woman on the street who is part of a community that makes architecture that grows out of the culture of a place, that is used with the materials that are there, is a collective act, is the art of construction, and the only thing it isn't is to do with is the business of architecture. So out of your 7 points, the only one I agree with on architecture is the last one, that architects don't get taught enough construction, because that's what makes great architecture without architects. I think what you're really talking about is not architecture, you're talking about the commercial business world of architecture, and almost every point you make comes from that position. It's not about architecture for me, it's about the business of architecture operating on an international scale in a kind of commercial world.
I think it's impossible to separate the two. I mean, there are so many books about works of architecture. The vast majority of books from the are about works of, I write about the work of an architect. And work of an architect is work, and work by definition is business. I think it is impossible to talk about architecture to separate it from the commercial realities. I think, in fact, those commercial realities largely explain architectural form as we stand. So yes, I write about the business of architecture, and by doing that, I write about architecture. By writing about architecture, I inevitably write about the business. Thank you. Of architecture. I think it's impossible to separate the two.
I just wonder if you could unpack the retirement at 67 thing. I mean, I'm 2 years ahead of you. So it's one of the reasons I came this evening, just to see if I could get some lead on it. Well, an extension. Is it? I mean, there's a conventional wisdom that architects get better as they get older. You know, you begin to encompass the subject, that's that. But is your comment on that, which and I also spoke recently to a 75-year-old, very well-known architect in this country, who said, I can't retire because what else would I do?
Yeah, but that I relate to very, very much. So it's one, actually the most daunting proposition in the entire list.
Okay, and,
in that sense.
and the other thing, is it that if we all retire at 67, A, that we're legally forced to, but the other one is, does that then free the marketplace up for younger people?
I think so. I think inevitably, that's it. But I mean, the retirement age is like the unions. They are things which are commonly deemed applicable to all industries. And one of the things I've been trying to do in this book is what happens if you regard architecture as a common industry and you hold it accountable to the same standards. Labor unions, workers' rights, fixed retirement ages, even the ownership is one of the chapters. And I think it's simply interesting to see what happens, because there is an immense fear. It's almost like the Prime Minister that gets re-elected 5 times and then says, I can't go because, I mean, I don't know who would do the job but me, you know. There is a lot of that, you know. I mean, the spectre of the old authoritarian male who is not just a spectre that haunts the world of politics. I mean, it is a spectre every bit present, I think, in our industry too. And yes, I think there is an enormously stifling effect of people who overstay their welcome. And I think that it simply will free up an enormous acceleration of younger generations, of a far more modern discussion, of a discussion that's far less against the grain. I think it would send the perfect signal, by the way, that a lot of these things are actually about signals. A lot of the things I recommend, now that I have more time to think about your question.
Signals.
Yeah, so a lot of these things are about signals. I think, you know, if we would slightly be less spastic about the moment a labour union presents itself in architecture, it's happened in New York, it's happened here, the reactions are pathetic. The lack of professionalism in the business is exposed in no uncertain terms, because they never thought of it, never thought it was possible, never thought that these people had rights, that they were even, they're just totally caught off guard, totally blindsided, and I think therefore to plead for labour unions is a wake-up call. Is a wake-up call on the broader notion that this is work, this is an industry, and if we want to, and you're always stronger as an industry than you are as a cult. You're always stronger as an industry than you are as a hobby, or an amateur gentleman steed, and that's in a way to bring it into the modern times, and I think retirement age is very, very much part of that. It's also scary, probably because we've done such a thing for such a long time, but we might do it, and we might be just fine.
But I think it's a really radical proposition, actually, because if we all thought that at 67 we leave, and it's good for us to know that without this ridiculous kind of fuzzy line. And I think it's one of your most deliverable propositions, now I come to think about it.
Well, I can contribute to it being done. The view is that that the rest of the world should operate as if America doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It was recently struck from, in the United States, I think it was recently struck from being a normal job, unlike doctors, unlike other professionals. So it definitely, and I think there is a bit of that in architecture already, and it's precisely the bit I don't like. I mean, I don't like it, for instance, at the AA, that every student you meet has wealthier parents than I did. Because otherwise they wouldn't be studying there, that there is no, I mean, I could study myself. I went through university on a scholarship, because otherwise I couldn't have studied, and I encounter less and less of that. And I think it's not good, and I would even go as far as to say that it directly affects the level of the work, and it directly affects the level of architecture that is produced. And so in that sense, scholarships is a missing thing, but I will add it in the sequel.
Overseas architect, registered in my country, but not in the UK still, because I just moved on. Struggling between the fact that to gain UK experience you have to be registered, and to be registered you have to have UK experience. Do you think that registration and licensing is helping architecture here in the UK, or it's just controlling who can exerce architecture in some countries, like if we're doing boundaries for architecture in the world?
Chris, could you
He's not an architect anymore. He's not an architect. I can't call myself, well, I can't call myself an architect here now, but in 5 years ago, I was working in Singapore or Australia. I can't call myself an architect in that country. So there's a lot of international protectionism, which we're trying to break down. But, you know, I think if you're an architect in one country, you should, if somebody wants to commission you to do a building in this country, you should be able to do it.
You can.
Very good. Well, thank you, Chris, for stepping in.
Yeah, because you don't need to call yourself an architect.
Yeah. Shoemaker, butcher, whatever, it all works, except for architects.
So maybe calling yourself an architect isn't that important these days then, if you're not calling yourself an architect, but also I think in the paper on city architects, the RIBA actually says that actually it needn't be called necessarily city architect, could be other names, placemakers or...
No.
I think city
I protest.
My view is that basically it's the RIBA's job to make the name architect worthy of, I'd say, employment. Thank you very much indeed. I would recommend everyone buy the book. It's hugely, it's well researched. There's a lot of stuff in there, and really interesting views that make you think a lot about what we're all doing in the world at the moment and what we're doing to the world. So thank you very much indeed for your...